All right, I think we're a couple minutes past 12, so I'm going to get this started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Shannon Van Raes, and I'm a news and reporter and features writer here at Future of Good. And I'm coming to you today from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the natural homeland of the Red River Métis. And before we get to what promises to be a very interesting discussion, a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, which you've all seen. You're also encouraged to drop any questions you have into the chat. And I'd also love it if folks took a moment to share something about their own organization there as well. And if you look, you'll find a link to Future of Good's latest story on Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy in the chats. So on to who we have with us here today. We have three leaders in their fields. We have Doug Kerr, who is the Executive Director of Dignity Network Canada, a group of civil society organizations involved in supporting the human rights of people regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics globally. We also have Julia Anderson, Chief Executive Officer for the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, which has a membership of more than 100 NGOs, academic institutes, health associations, and individuals partnering to improve health outcomes for women and children in more than 1,000 communities worldwide. And finally, we have Natalia Karboska, who is the Director of Strategic Development and co-founder of the Ukrainian Women's Fund, which is the only women's fund in Ukraine and has provided more than 3 million USD in grants to women's rights NGOs in Ukraine, as well as neighboring countries, Moldova and Belarus. So I think we'll kick things off now that I've talked a bit by having each of our panelists give a brief synopsis of the work their organization does and how, or perhaps if, Canada's Feminist International Policy has affected that work. So Doug, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Hi, everybody. My name is Doug Kerr, he, him pronouns. I am based in Toronto, which of course is here in Ontario on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And I am the Executive Director of Dignity Network Canada. We are a national coalition of about 60 organizations across the country who are involved in the human rights, promoting and advancing and connecting on human rights of people on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. So sometimes described as LGBTIQ in this context in Canada. And we're a pretty broad-based coalition. Some of our members are international cooperation organizations. Many of them are queer organizations. And what sort of brings us all together is a belief that we can work together to support the human rights of queer and trans people around the world. So in terms of the FIAP, we've been around since 2015. And, when I think about the FIAP that was, developed in 2015, 2016, and created in 2017, to be honest, and I think hopefully we can have a really frank conversation. I even went back and looked at the original document from 2017 and because I recall, doing a scan again of LGBTIQ, so GS in the document, and it's actually nowhere. And it doesn't actually come through at all. And I think when we think about the auditor's report that came out that looked at 2017 to 2021, there's a recommendation or an assessment that the FIAP was not very intersectional and really didn't look beyond gender and age, and that there was a need to be thinking about ability issues, ethnicity, race, religion, sexuality, some of the issues we work on, and even thinking about the diversity of gender, right? And I think things have evolved over the past 6 years, and maybe we can get into that a little bit. But from our perspective, the FIAP, I think on a positive sense, was a good foundation in terms of providing a framework for thinking in a feminist context and addressing issues facing women and girls and gender diverse people. However, in its implementation, There's lots of challenges that I think were identified in the auditor's report, but also ones that we've seen very anecdotally, and I can get into that a little bit more. So in terms of the work we do, we provide support to our members around SOGIESC issues. We connect with partners around the world. And we also, some of our members are funded through Global Affairs to a specific program to do work on SOGIESC issues. And I can talk about that a little bit later because it is something that's not connected to the FIAP, but maybe fits under the umbrella. And it's sort of, I guess, if you look at the FIAP as an evergreen framework that can grow and change, that would be it's a good example of how the FIAP can grow, right? So I can maybe get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Thanks.
Perfect. No, that's very expansive, and I look forward to drilling down on some of those really interesting things and important things that you've raised. So for now, I'll pass it over to Julia, and I'll just ask you to give us the same sort of synopsis and explain a little bit about how FIAP intersects with your own work.
Thanks, Shannon. And hello, everyone. Nice to see lots of familiar names on the screen. So my name is Julia. I'm with the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, and I'm located in Peterborough, Ontario. And there's my phone ringing. Sorry about that. And it is the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe people. And I've spent time learning with elders here and hope that everything I say gives honor to those teachings and teachings that have been around for, well, since the beginning of time. So CanWatch is an organization concerned with women and children's rights, and we talk about women in all their diversity and children in all their diversity. And we were born out of the Muskoka Initiative, which was a very kind of a narrow and focused, which has its benefits, initiative under the Harper government that wanted to see shifts and changes in the Millennium Development Goals that had been the furthest left behind, which was maternal health and newborn health. So I say that backgrounder because I think it's really interesting to think about the way that the FIAP engaged with and talked to the initiatives that already existed, right? So Muskoka, at the time when the FIAP was introduced, was still being implemented, right? Because the previous government had locked in these commitments because they were thought that they were really important to maternal and newborn child health. And so the policy in some ways had to grapple with, okay, well, what are some of the things that Muskoka is doing, the initiatives funded there are doing really well, and how could we shift and improve them? And of course, the major missing piece to the Muskoka Initiative was a focus on sexual health and reproductive rights, a cornerstone feminist issue that's addressed in the FIAP. And so really it became about, the FIAP became very additive to the work that our members do in countries all over the world. And so to me, it's really interesting to think about that because it wasn't just about, it was both about what Doug referred to, the new initiatives that were launched under the broad umbrella, as you said, Doug, for the FIAP, but also about, okay, how are we going to shift and change and bring about a consistency in our programming to really get to that transformational, transformative approach to gender equality, and of course to improving health outcomes for women and children. And I think it's the Auditor General's report. The important clarification is it's not a report on the FIAP. It's not looking at, is the FIAP good enough? Was the FIAP missing things? Is the FIAP what it's a report on? And it's not a report on whether or not there's impact happening. The Auditor General is looking at what is the ability of Global Affairs Canada to implement a policy, that policy being the FIAP. So are they able to demonstrate that they are implementing the FIAP, right? That's a very different question than is the FIAP good and important? And it's a very different question of, is there good and important work happening, right? And I think we have to be very careful not to confuse those things, because when I look at the transformative work being undertaken by my members, we're a proud member of the Dignity Network as well, by the members of all the networks that we're involved in. I mean, the FIAP has set a tone that I think is really, really important, and amazing work is happening. And so to me, if we want to have a conversation about do we need to replace the FIAP with something else, absolutely, let's have that conversation. Do we need to have a conversation about is the work that we're undertaking globally having the most impact possible? Absolutely, let's have that conversation. Let's not bring the Auditor General in, who's focused on a very different set of things, and confuse those conversations. So maybe I'll just leave it there with my introductory remarks, and happy to dig into this and all these things.
Thank you for that nuance. I think that's really important and something that will keep coming up as a theme as we go through this conversation. So we're going to throw it over to Natalia if she is able. There she is. And I'll have you tell us a little bit more about your organization and the work that you do, and also how it interacts with Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Natalia Kargovska, and I am the Director of Strategic Development of the Ukrainian Women's Fund. We are based in Ukraine, in Kyiv. We work here in Ukraine, and I apologize, you probably noticed that I am not in the office. I am actually joining from the car. I'm on the way from the meeting with our grantees in one of the western regions of Ukraine. But I hope my connection will be stable because I'm about to enter Kyiv, my home city. So basically, the fund was created 23 years ago by the group of Ukrainian feminists. We had the idea at that time that it is important for us to have a local Ukrainian organization that will be deeply rooted in the movement, that will represent the movement and will mobilize resources, different types of resources to support organizations which are part of the movement. Very importantly, grassroots women's organizations, those who do not often have access to different types of resources. So this is how we started, and this is what we continue doing during all these 23 years. And this idea of the strong and local movement is very much in line with one of the flagship initiatives of FIAP, Women's Voice and Leadership Project. And therefore, we are actually one of the several women's funds globally that are implementing women's voice and leadership. So we are the Global Affairs Canada partner in Ukraine implementing Women's Voice and Leadership Project during the 4 years already. So we are learning by doing. This is our first experience actually with GAC. We did work with different governments, but not with Canadian one. This experience is quite new for us, but overall, I think that we both are learning, not only us in Ukraine, but also I very much hope that our counterparts in the Canadian Embassy in Ukraine, but also at the GAC not a lot. They are learning from this experience, and we are trying to to be as open with them as possible.
Excellent. I like that you're both learning. That's a great way of encapsulating this. And I think that's very, very apt. I'll just take a moment to remind people, I'm sure everyone is aware of the Auditor General's report, but that's sort of the context that we're looking at this in today. That was, tabled in late March, and it was pretty harsh, but it was directed at Global Affairs Canada. And I think it ultimately summed it up as saying they were unable to accurately track and report the overall outcomes of funded projects against the goals stated in the policy, which sort of brings me to the question I have for you, Julia. And this, I'm going to take you back to the initial launch of Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy back in June of 2017. CanWatch posted a commentary at the time on its website And this is a quote from that. It said, "The challenge with the current international assistance policy document is that the practicalities, are largely missing. The how, who, and where, the parts that will actually make a difference and determine the effectiveness of policy and practice remain unclear. So too is the link to international standards for aid effectiveness." Now, obviously, this was almost 6 years ago. Has there been change over the last 6 years? Have you seen improvements, over the last 6 years in how global affairs has tracked and measures efficacy?
We were feeling so spicy back then, 6 years ago, being so critical. I think there's so much to unpack in this question, in the sense of the devil really is in the details when it comes to international assistance. I mean, you are managing complexity that just doesn't exist when you're building roads here in Canada, when you're doing, sure, there's complexities, but you're not dealing with entire other kind of currencies, nation states, ways of operating, right? And so measuring within that context is it's a real challenge. It's a real hurdle to come over, in any sort of implementation. And I think where the government got it wrong, as we said 6 years ago, and I stand by in the FIAP, is in not really articulating some of their thinking. So what were going to be the pieces within the mechanics of global affairs, something like the difference between a contribution agreement. I heard Natalia there. I read between the lines, as I'm sure Doug probably did too. We both run coalitions that are funded by Government of Canada. I heard in that we're all learning, and that's how I would have said, over the past 6 years working with Global, we're all learning, and it's not easy, right? And what are some of the mechanics there that are creating the bottlenecks to effectiveness? One of the pieces is how they count and thinking about how they count. So working with IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, working with OECD DAC and being an active participant in conversations about overall aid effectiveness. And we could talk for an hour, we could talk for 10 hours about that. It's something I'm very interested in, and CanWatch is very interested in, how you actually, what kind of indicators you choose, what kind of frameworks for indicators you choose. And I think overall, Canada has done some good work on this. For example, introducing out of the Thrive Initiative for $14 billion over 10 years, the largest and longest ever commitment to a single initiative by Government of Canada, and that's to women and children's health. As part of that, they've introduced a new indicator around abortion, one that doesn't exist at the OECD, and that we are actually tracking independently of that. That's some great work. The overall accountability framework for that Thrive commitment, which is a piece of, informed by the FIAP as other initiatives. I think there's been some great work. Where I think we really need to rethink our approach is in that kind of bigger picture, and the bigger picture of aid accountability and the details of how we implement. And so something like shifting from from grants, shifting from contribution agreements to grants. I mean, I talked about that in the piece. It's a huge, the accountability difference is zero. So you are just as accountable to the impact you're trying to have, but the tracking difference and the way in which you track is fundamentally different. It reduces the burden for organizations like CanWatch, for organizations like Natalia's, for Doug's, right? Like, it reduces the burden, how many staff we have to have counting postage stamps, and helps us focus on how are we making a strategic and important impact. So some of the thinking around that was really lacking in the FIAP, of like, how are we going to change the mechanics, the physics of aid, right? Like, the physics of aid, that formula has been so off and so heavily burdened towards tracking for the sake of tracking, and absent of the conversation of accountability for whom, right? Because we're not accountable to Global Affairs Canada. We're accountable to the impact we're trying to have around the world, to the communities within which we are trying to see change, right? And support change, I should say, not see change, support the change that they want to see. right? That's a fundamentally different way of thinking about these questions, and one that as a feminist international assistance policy, presuming there's a feminist approach, really isn't kind of thought through and articulated. So you asked me if I think that there's been improvements. Like in everything, I think there's been improvements in certain areas, in certain pockets. I think some of the accountability work on the announcement and the commitment that we're most concerned of, because we've had a strong civil society push, there's been some really amazing work, and I will be very sad to lose some of our key colleagues within global affairs when they get transferred out, who have pushed and made sure there's political commitment all the way down on that accountability. But at the same time, I think the overall, we could have come out the gate so much stronger if we had done some of this thinking at the beginning and said, look, we're going to both take a feminist approach in the substantive, the type of work we're choosing to do, and how we're choosing to do that work, right? Because I think the with whom and the what type of work was fairly well articulated. Is really about those the physics of it, like the actual implementation on the ground. What does that formula look like?
Sure. Just to follow up on that, I mean, with the Auditor General's findings focus so heavily on, areas that not the areas that we're discussing right now, and, kind of obscuring some of these deeper issues, is there a risk that is going to, halt the momentum of FIAP, that there may be a pullback from this program in light of some of this criticism?
I think there's a major risk. I think there's, on one hand, I think no bad press is still press, and that's good. I think anytime we can get international development into the common lexicon of Canadians thinking about it, I'm for it, even if it is, a critique. I think people thinking about it and asking questions is really, that is part of the national discourse, is really important. But yes, I think there's a perception of aid ineffectiveness that is a major barrier to people's decision makers' belief that we should invest more. I think that was like 16 double negatives, but what I'm trying to say is the fact that a belief exists that aid is ineffective. And when that belief is supported by an Auditor General's report who's saying, yeah, they can't even measure this. Like, they can't even tell you what they're doing. If you heard that coming out of your child's school, if you heard it coming out of your hospital, they have no idea if they're doing good with patient outcomes. Like, you'd be like, oh my goodness, like, what are you, that's not great, right? And it kind of feeds into this narrative that is a convenient narrative when you're moving into an economy that's more strapped, when you're moving into a time where the scarcity mentality is going to reign supreme, and when you're moving into a time with a possible change of government. I think it's kind of handing on a silver platter something to politicians or decision makers that is just, quite frankly, inaccurate and doesn't capture at all the important nuances of international development effectiveness.
For sure. Doug, building on that, how in your view, do you keep this relevant and convince Canadians and your members that this is working, that more money should go here? How do you make that case to the Canadian public?
Oh, well, I actually think that I just want to react as well to something Julia said that I totally agree with. I think from the get-go, I think the FIAP, the questions of like the principles and what is feminist funding were perhaps missing in some ways. And I saw Beth Warniak from the Equality Fund here, and I think there's some really good work that has happened right over the past 7 years around that as a result of some of the funding. Maybe not like it sort of happened not because of the way that the government created the framework, but in spite of it, I don't know, but there have been some really good things done over the last 7 years to really talk about what is good feminist funding, good feminist funding practice and the principles, and what does it mean to shift power and to give voice to people who haven't had that. And that does require a complete rethink of those systems that crush organizations. And now they're finally, with the grants and contribution transformation project, I think they're finally kind of clicking in on some of this, and like, you know, some of how that impacts feminist groups, queer groups on the ground that we really want to empower, right, that are in this system. So I do think that, you know, that some of that stuff we missed the boat on with the overall framework, but it's changing. Now, to your question about engaging Canadians and I mean, that's a lot of our work, right? So we're an intersectional group, and some of our members are getting global affairs money for the first time to do work with queer and trans communities around the world. And here in Canada, you know, there's a very vibrant 2S LGBTQ community across the country. There are lots of pride festivals and ways to engage with the community. And there's kind of there's an awareness that queer and trans people around the world have it quite rough in different situations, and people are kind of generally have some knowledge of that. I don't think people quite understand what Canada is doing to support those communities around the world. It's not very much. I mean, one thing I did want to share as well, and I think it's just important in a forum like this to really say, is that, you know, in the context of Canada's international assistance, which is, well, in the Auditor General, the report, they looked at the 2017 to 2021, and I think they said about $5 billion a year. Well, what percent of that do you think goes to support the human rights of LGBTQ people? Well, it's about 0.1%. So it's 0.1%, right? And now, granted, under the Harper years, it was 0.02%. So it's gone up, but we're talking about small amounts of money when we talk about targeted funding. And but all that to say, you know, the last 5 years have seemed finally, it takes time to move money out. Some of the work that we're involved in, there are some, I would almost call them pilot programs, where Global Affairs are funding some of our members to start to partner with groups around the world on addressing LGBTQ human rights. And it's part of our job to really talk about what's happening and why it's a good thing in a way that does no harm. And we don't want to put, again, in our work, put people in danger in certain countries where we really shouldn't be talking about, you know, too much about Canadian aid doing that work, but there are many contexts where we can. So I do think that there are some things in the auditor's report as well that are actually, I guess I could say opportunities. I mean, I do think if you care about gender equality issues, I mean, one of the pieces of the report talked about how Canada wasn't meeting its targets on gender targeting, right? And that's really important, because what that is we're actually naming and focusing on women and girls and gender diverse people. And that's an area where we can go further, where, you know, folks like myself and our members that are really trying to focus on some of the most marginalized people, women and girls who face different issues because of their sexuality or gender identity, trans people, that this is an area where we could be doing more targeted work, right? And so that's certainly something I see as an opportunity to do more work with Global Affairs to help them achieve some of those goals. So I do think that even though, but again, you kind of hear, as Julia said, auditor report and the focus on the outcome question, right, which we maybe talk a little bit more about, but that I really worry, you know, that could shadow some of the other pieces that are actually are opportunities for those of us who care about equity and diversity to really improve the FIAP and to really build on it. So I think that there are some opportunities there to engage with people more if they understood where where Canadian money is actually making a difference. And sometimes it's just storytelling, sometimes it's just meeting people, you know, and I think just knowing that Canadian money is actually saving lives and changing lives is really important. But again, I do kind of worry a little bit, like Julie does, about that this could result in even more burdens on organizations. And maybe just finally, an example I just want to share with you all. One of the organizations that's getting funding through the Act Together for Inclusion Fund, which is a small fund that was launched in 2020, we're a partner in it, and it funds some of our members to do work to support the LGBTI human rights around the world. One of the groups getting money is a small grassroots organization in Peru called Feminist Peru. And they're doing amazing work. This grant is small, like the grant itself, I think total 200,000, and it's with a Canadian partner, but it's been transformational for these women in regions of Peru. And it's huge for them, like it's massive. And it's really amplifying their work in ways that were unthinkable. And I'm so excited to talk about it because it's such a great project. It's not a large project in terms of the FI app, but it's a really powerful, impactful project that's actually making a huge difference. And I worry, though, that that they're already struggling with some of the pressures of sending in receipts and timesheets and reporting mechanisms. And there is a Canadian partner to buffer some of that, but it still cascades down on the organization. So, I know we're working with our colleagues at like the Equality Fund and others to really try and think through how to support these groups on the ground that I think Canadians and Global Fair Canada really want to support. Right. And I don't think so. I think that the opportunity to talk about the work of something like Feminist Peru is great. And so, I think, that's all I'll say for now.
No, it sounds like a great program. I feel like I could have a whole other avenue just to discuss that. But to pivot a little bit, I mean, when we think of international aid and assistance and development, we don't normally look to the United States. But when it comes to trans issues, there's a lot of very scary stuff happening there right now that's putting these issues, a little more forefront here in Canada. I mean, how would you think about making targets and including specific targets for LGBTI and trans initiatives in FIAP? Is that something that could be done going forward to really solidify our impact in that area?
Well, I suppose it depends what you mean. I mean, there's targets in terms of money, right? And targeted goals. And as I said, in 2019, Canada did announce, and it's rolling out now, sort of the first ever targeted set of funding programs. Again, it's not very big. I mean, the government announced $30 million, which really works out over 5 years. So that works out to $6 million a year, right? And they do talk about it a lot. I mean, it's quite remarkable to me in the context of a $5 billion program, how often I hear the government talk about this program, because it's really quite small, but it is a targeted program. And for LGBTIQ folks around the world and communities, and within that, some of the projects are targeting trans and intersex people, which are the sub community with very specific types of issues. I think that the government is trying, and it's partly my work, to work with Global Affairs to track this money. And as a community activist, I think it's an interesting question. There is an accountability, because we advocated for this particular fund. There's an accountability back to the community, and we have a mechanism where we talk to GAC about how's it going, what are they doing, and what is the program funding. And so I do think that there is an opportunity that the trans and intersex work within the LGBTI community is important. I think that it's sometimes difficult to track and to count in terms of people being served. I think that's quite difficult and can be challenging because of self-disclosure, lots of issues around data collection. There are lots of us that are working on this in other donor countries as well, and it's an issue domestically. But I do think that tracking the money and targeted money is what we can do. And I think that, and I do believe, and it's one of our network goals, to try and increase the targeted amount of money to about $20 million a year. Right. And so, not to say that the integrated work can happen, that being LGBTIQ work integrated into gender equality, just as I put gender equality into broader programs. But it's very important for us that there are targeted programming. Again, some of the challenges with trans and intersex work is done by, and queer work in general, is done by very grassroots groups, and mechanisms of funding can be challenging. There really aren't trans and intersex groups that could handle like a $5 million or $10 million grant, right? So we really need intermediaries and models of funding that can support grassroots groups to get funding.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks for drilling down on that. I really appreciate that. And I'm also very thankful that Natalia's connection is back and she is on the screen again. So I'm going to go straight to her before anything disconnects us. I wanted to follow up on what you said about your organization learning, but also Global Affairs Canada learning. I'm hoping you can expand a bit on what are some of the lessons that you've learned, what works well, and what do you think could work better in the relationship?
I think one of the most important learnings for all of us is actually the importance of people beyond the numbers and beyond the reports. And this is what we very clearly see working at the grassroots level with small local organizations that are making huge change in Ukraine. And I think it became even more visible after the full-scale Russian aggression in Ukraine, because I can also speak with the examples, and actually the example which is from today, from my meetings today in this small city called Khmelnytsky, where we supported the creation within Women's Voice and Leadership. We supported the creation of 6 new women's rights organizations, both in the city and also in the neighbor areas in this region. And, after the full-scale invasion, we saw, how effective these organizations and these women leaders were in responding to challenges that women faced. They were, in many cases, the first ones who responded because, when all this happened in February last year, humanitarian donors were not there. Nobody knew kind of what to do, how to react. There were, huge numbers of internally displaced people, mostly women. And these small grassroots organizations, they took the lead. They become, they created humanitarian coordination centers in their communities. They started to do amazing work to support women. And sometimes it's difficult to feature all this work in the reports, right, in the numbers. And therefore, I think this is one of their kind of major learnings for us, how to, that we need to be really creative and flexible in showing the effectiveness of our work. Another important learning is that time is needed to to make the change, especially if we are talking about systemic changes. And often donors are kind of so much looking for fast results. And it is really difficult to achieve them if you're having, 6 months or 1 year approach. And I think our experience with GAC, our experience with Women's Voice and Leadership, which is multi-year project, shows that if there is enough time, you can work with organizations, with the leaders, you can nurture them and provide them support, and then everybody will see the results. This is also, another important lesson that we are learning. Also, the question of trust. Especially when it is about the government funding and when it is about the taxpayers' money. It is very important to not be afraid to support local people and to listen to local people. Often we still see, unfortunately, I'm not talking about GAC, I'm talking about the other situations that we are observing, and we are trying to change actually, that their new initiatives, new strategies are developed without input from local people. They are just parachuted to the local level with the idea that local organizations organizations, the movements, will be happy to have money and, will start implementing the strategies immediately. But if we are not involved in their development, they will not necessarily work in the right way. So this is also another lesson, a positive lesson actually with GAG, that, that I know that so many feminists, so many organizations, so many activists, including Equality Fund, were participated in the development of this initiative. And this resulted really in a very flexible, in our opinion, project, and the whole philosophy, I think of women's voice and leadership. So these are the major lessons that we are learning.
Thank you for that. Maybe just to expand a little bit more, the current funding model, I mean, so much has had to change since the Russian invasion. So many organizations are retooling, redirecting their efforts. Is the current funding formula from the Canadian government, is that flexible enough to meet the needs or the ground, on the needs that are on the ground? Has it been enough to allow organizations to change direction when they need to, or are there things that could make it more flexible?
Well, I can share positive experience on this because it happened that just few weeks before the full-scale invasion, we signed the contracts with 20 women's rights organizations, which received multi-year funding for advocacy. And then their invasion happened, and of course the priorities changed. And as I said, there was a need to support humanitarian work, and we just asked GAG whether it's possible to change these contracts, and we received the answer, I think, in few days, that yes, it is possible. So basically, we approached all organizations and said, those who would like to change the contract and repurpose them, you can do this easily. And I think this is one of the perfect examples when the bureaucracy could be changed very quickly. Of course, another example of the effectiveness is the travel grants program that we launched. These are small individual grants for activists, for feminists to participate in different international events on women's rights and gender equality. And the reason why we launched travel grants now is that we are hearing from different feminist movements abroad, we Ukrainian feminist movement. We are hearing, different advices and different rhetoric about feminists and anti-military, which is not our rhetoric. And we think it is important for us to be at these platforms and to talk about our perspective. And again, women's voice and leadership was very flexible, allowing us to launch the program and, support activists who are now traveling and, explaining our perspective on this.
Oh, thank you for that. That's a positive story. That's great to hear. And I guess sort of keeping the feeling of flexibility, Julia, I'm going to return to you. I know when we spoke a few weeks ago, we discussed the shift from programming via contribution agreement to programming via grant. And you touched on this today as well. But maybe you could drill down a little bit on what the difference in those two models are and how shifting from one to another might benefit, those working in the sector.
Sure, and just to build on maybe as a preface, because something that was said, I think great to hear the stories of the flexibility that was there, and I think that comes down a lot to high-level political commitment for flexibility, but also the individual program officers and project officers involved, right? And what we've seen over the years, and this was true when I worked at a small organization that was funded by CETA, so 3 names ago, before DFAT-D, before Global Affairs Canada. Those program officers and those project officers have a huge influence. Their ability to manage up and manage over within their own systems of authority can be a determining factor in whether or not you receive flexibility. And when asked to, grapple with how one would address this to actually shift it, I mean, in my head, it's got to be incentive structures, right? Where you see, and this is getting into like the nitty-gritty of kind of bureaucratic or governance and the way that works. But I was speaking with a parliamentary secretary about it a couple of weeks ago at an event. I said, there needs to be incentive structures within Global Affairs Canada to start saying yes and, to start really shifting, and that needs to be from the program officer up. And so you can see it with more perhaps delegated authority could be a big difference. So if project officers could actually make a few more decisions without having the burden of having to get that through managers, right? Decisions that make sense and be evaluated based on the judgment that they exercise versus their ability to convince their boss to check off on something. Like, there's different ways that we could think about doing that, but we need to think about doing that. Like, we need to think about transforming Global Affairs Canada to be the feminist, to implement a feminist approach. And like was mentioned, I mean, Equalities Fund, there's been so much great work on this done external to global affairs. How can we start bringing some of those lessons inside and making recommendations that really work to make those shifts? And I often mention Citizenship and Immigration Canada, who, I mean, they're in hot water about visas and all kinds of things right now, but there was a major shift and change in the way that they approached their work when the government's changed over. And this was noted, this was well studied, and kind of there was some academic inquiry into it. And to me, it's like, let's look at that. Let's look at any country with a functioning bureaucracy, how do you actually shift and change those Titanics of decision making? And then let's think about how we could do that within Global Affairs Canada. In terms of that's the inside job, right? And it's what, when I've made recommendations or made pushes, it's become clear to me that I don't know enough to make really smart recommendations about how they could make those changes and shifts. Like I've often said, I want to go back and be an intern and just like carry paper from one office to the other to actually understand the ways in which decisions are carried around and made, because I'm smart enough, and I don't get sometimes why there's such resistance to these change. And then, I mean, the work that's being done that Doug referred to on the grants and contributions work, it's about this. It's about how they externally engage and trying to, like if you take a step back and you say, okay, let's say we're capitalist investors in new businesses, and we're like venture capitalists, that's what they're called. I don't even know what they're called, but we're venture capitalists, and we're looking at our portfolio and we're saying, okay, we're willing to take, in order to make the kind of money we want to make, we're willing to say that 10% of our money is going to be wasted, right? Like it's going to fail. We're going to have a 10% fail rate. And we accept that, or 15% or whatever. What global affairs and what our thinking in international development has failed to do is to think in that way that says, instead we say, we're going to spend millions of dollars to make sure that we have a 0% fail rate, which is first of all impossible. And second of all, you're wasting 20% of your money chasing after you're throwing good money after bad, in the sense of chasing down postage stamp based accountability, rather than saying, okay, if we trust our partners to implement, we've looked at their organizational infrastructure, we believe that they're doing good work, we trust them like we trust the multilaterals, so we throw money at, and we invest in, and we're going to say, based on that trust, based on your track record, based on what we understand about you, we're going to give you a grant instead of a contribution agreement, which has 1/16 of the paperwork required to support it. 1/16 of the time, I'm making that up, Kim, who's on the call, might be able to tell us, because they had a CA and then I think moved to a grant, but correct me if I'm wrong. But for organizations who've done that, could they tell us how much less work is it to work with a grant versus a contribution agreement? How much more work could we do? Like actually good work could we do? And like if you unlock that in the sector and say, yes, some money we're going to lose track of or whatever, we accept a 5% loss in order to unlock the millions of minds that are wasting time being accountable for postage stamps that don't matter. Right, rather than live. So that's my soapbox rant. I think there's a lot of different ways to do that, but I think there needs to be this inside job and this some of the mechanics of the outside stuff needs to change as well.
For sure. No, I appreciate that. That was very illustrative, and I think it puts it in context in a really nice way. Going to jump to an audience question before I give us sort of, I know we're getting light on time, so I do want to have a roundup question, but an audience member has asked, how can people outside of GAC and the humanitarian sector learn about the work that is happening? How would someone find out about that work that's going on, for example, through the PF in sub-Saharan Africa? So I don't know who wants to answer that, but how would you find out about what's going on if you wanted to take a look and see what's in progress?
Maybe I'll just jump in. I mean, I'm relatively new in some ways to international cooperation work. I mean, in the context of like some of you, but it's been a challenge to find out what's going on. I think the government has, GAC has its own tools, a lot of, I would say, almost cumbersome communication mechanisms. There are, you can go to the GAC website and they'll have various examples and stories and of FIAP programs, and sometimes they're good. We were part of one. It took a long time to get developed. I was shocked how long it took to write a one-page article in terms of the back and forth and all of the stuff that needed to happen. I mean, I'd be curious to know what my colleagues think, but there are networks such as ours, such as Julia, such as Cooperation Canada. There's others that are almost places where we are putting out materials about what our members are doing, because it is somewhat overwhelming in terms of all the work that's happening. But for the work we work on, we are producing materials and information about the sliver of work that we do on SOGIEC issues. So I think it's a little bit of both in terms of like looking at what the official global affairs materials are, and then kind of going to some of the key implementers. I would say, the Equality Fund's been mentioned. They're doing some amazing. Equality Fund has produced some gorgeous, beautiful reports on women's voice and a number of their programs, like Women's Voice and Leadership. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that people can get information.
Excellent. Julia or Natalia, anything to add to that?
I think this is also our lesson learned. I think there is a room for us to improve on how we communicate our work, and reports are not enough. Reports on the websites are not enough. I think we need to think about the ways how to talk to, not only to those who are within our bubble, right? But those who are outside, and I think the question was also about this. So I think we need to kind of to work more with creative industry, with creative feminists on the ways how to pitch the stories of our grantees, the stories of our beneficiaries in a very kind of attractive way for those who are not necessarily within our bubble yet.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And Julia, anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I just put a couple links and then open up the chat, and I'm smiling at some of the comments. So I put a couple links. CanWatch has a data exchange, data explorer, and an analytics portal that does, it is kind of reports, but it is aggregated, and you can search actually by region and by issue area. So it's quite as far as data portals, it's quite sophisticated. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And you can filter based on your region, or you can filter based on the type of interventions and things like that. So I put the link there. You just look up CanWatch and the data exchange.
Excellent. That's great. I'm going to copy that now so I don't lose it. And, finally, this is a question I want to put to everyone, and it's a bit of a big one, but I'll ask you to maybe keep it to 2 or 3 minutes each, because I know the clock is ticking down. But I'd like to know what each of you would like to see when it comes to measuring FIAP's impact. How could global affairs improve, how not just FIAP is administered, but how it's actually evaluated and how we define and judge impact? What would you like to see? And I think, Natalia, I'll start with you just in case we lose you again.
Well, I think we need, when the war in Ukraine started back in 2014, and there was the first wave of internally displaced people, and we were trying to support their integration into host communities. We were looking for the indicators, how to measure this. And someone told me about a very interesting concept of everyday peace indicators, meaning that, if the neighbors started to say hello to newcomers, to IDPs, this is the indicator that they are welcomed in the community. I think for FIAP, we need to think about this everyday, progress indicator, everyday peace indicator for us, maybe everyday feminist indicator, something that will be creative, not very bureaucratic, and something that will show that we are indeed making a long-term impact.
Excellent. No, that sounds very forward-thinking. So I'll move it up to Julia next.
Right, I love that, and I am going to contact you afterwards with some of the stuff I saw on Women's Voice in News and tracking that. It's similar. It's a passive way of tracking. Are women heard as experts? And what does that mean when we're not expert? When 80% of the experts that come on the news are men, what does that mean, right? And so anyway, same everyday indicator type things. The two things I would say, budget transparency versus spending transparency. I think that could have a transformative change if we actually think about doing a renovation. If you held your contractors accountable for what they spent afterwards and didn't have a conversation about budget, how does that work, right? We need to have conversations about accountability from the beginning, which is when Global Affairs Canada is budgeting to spend the money. And then because you could actually influence and shift things then, right? And so budget accountability. And then I would say, a focus in on accountability within the different portfolios. So let's actually get gritty about the kinds of indicators that Natalia talked about the kind of communities that Doug is concerned about. Let's actually get gritty about what we're chasing after, and within portfolios start tracking better. Even if the FIAP, I'm not a fan of a review of the FIAP at this time. I don't think it makes sense for us to spend time there. I think it's really about getting into the different programmatic areas.
Great. And Doug, you're already there. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'd like to see, I think I'd like to see, I'm going to bring it back to Trans Feminista Peru and those women working in Peru. That group of women that are actually transforming their communities and their life. I think that there is a piece here that I would love to see more around those women using the tools we have with technology, with Zoom, with storytelling, with video, an element of report back to stakeholders where people say what happened. I think that there are probably examples out there of how this has been done, but I think that it leads to your question earlier about Canadian buy-in to this. I think that reports and the data collection is obviously important, but I think that there needs to be elements of the women, the people, the queer people that we're trying to support around the world, telling their story to other people. And we're trying to do everything we can to amplify those voices. So I would like to see over the next year or two for us, more opportunities for those people impacted by the programs that were launched to tell their stories in person or virtually.
Excellent. I think that's a great note to end it on. You've probably seen a little survey pop up, so make sure to fill that out in the last moments. Just want to thank Doug, Julia, and Natalia again for all taking time out of their very busy days to discuss this, and I hope everyone has learned something. So going to wish everyone a lovely afternoon, and I hope to see you all again. Take care.